This is Franklin Rye, and welcome back to Political Spirits. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated, at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? First, let me apologize for being a day late in releasing this episode. I had a family matter to which I needed to attend. Well, let's talk for a moment about President Trump's CPAC speech. His speech to the Conservative Political Action Committee on Saturday, March 2nd, weighed in at 2 hours and 2 minutes. Now think back to all of the long speeches that you've seen him give at rallies all around the country. Think about all the times when he's taken one-off questions from the media and where he's opened up White House meetings to the media. The level of access he's provided to the news media has been unprecedented. And notwithstanding the conflicts he has with the news media over how he has characterized many of its members, some have recognized the unprecedented level of access he's provided. And I'm not just talking about Fox News. For example, Rick Klein, political director for ABC News, told CBNNews.com in an interview available on the Internet dated May 25, 2018, comparing the Trump White House to those of the Obama and George W. Bush administrations, quote, "In terms of just the access to the thinking of the president and what the president is doing, this White House is above and beyond, far and away more accessible." He went on to note that, quote, "The amount of information flowing out of the president himself, not to mention the White House itself, is unparalleled." Now, I'm not surprised that Klein also raised some objections about the content of the information, but the point is he acknowledged that there's a tremendous amount of info and access being provided. For any of you out there who are questioning the content of that interview based on the fact it was with the Christian Broadcasting Network, which you may view as a Trump-supporting outlet, when you look it up online, you'll see that the interview itself was filmed and available with the article, so you don't have to rely on just the excerpts that appear in the article. You can watch the entire interview. What exactly did President Trump talk about for 2 hours and 2 minutes? Well, frankly, darn near everything. But I want to bring up one thing, not just because I think it's so important, but also because I want to brag about seeing it coming. You may recall back in episode 4 of this podcast, entitled Everybody Knows It, I talked about whether President Trump might do something to address the problem of suppression of free speech on college campuses. And in episode 24, which was last week and which was entitled Political Violence, Diversity of Thought, and a B-17 Crash, I talked about a recruiter for Turning Point USA who was attacked on the UC Berkeley campus, presumably for the act of recruiting for a conservative organization on that campus, including receiving a very hard, audible punch to the face. Well, President Trump invited that young man who was attacked onto the stage at CPAC. His name is Hayden Williams, and President Trump noted that, quote, "He took a punch for all of us, and we should never allow that to happen," close quote. I should note that the police have arrested 28-year-old Zachary Greenberg for the assault. He is, of course, innocent until proven guilty, but you couldn't possibly get a better still photograph of the attacker than what we have here, and he sure looks like the same guy. So what more did Trump say regarding the issue of free speech on college campuses? He promised to issue an executive order that would require colleges to support free speech to be eligible to receive research grants from the federal government. As the president said, if they want our dollars, and we give it to them by the billions, they got to allow people like Hayden and many other great young people and old people to speak. In episode 4, I floated a proposal which goes further than what the president is apparently now proposing, although we haven't seen the text yet. The proposal which I floated for discussion and said I can see the Trump administration issuing was more aggressive. Specifically, I said, so what about this idea? The Trump administration issues guidance in the form of an executive order or otherwise, indicating that in the future, colleges which do not teach a diversity of thought in the classroom and through invited speakers will not be considered educational institutions and will therefore not receive federal grant money or federal funding of any kind, and student loans and grants will not be eligible to be used to attend such institutions. So what I floated was directed more towards invited speakers as opposed to on-campus recruitment for organizations expressing different viewpoints. But the substance is the same, because that recruitment is in and of itself speech. Moreover, one of the main goals of organizations such as Turning Point USA is to bring conservative speakers on campus, where the proposal which President Trump described is less aggressive than what I floated is that it's apparently going to be limited to federal research dollars, whereas I was floating the idea of a proposal which would actually prevent students from using federally subsidized student loans to attend universities which don't meet the requirements of the executive order. In that respect, what I was floating is much more aggressive, much more likely to elicit howls of protest from universities and from some students than what the president appears to be ready to issue. In that respect, notwithstanding the constant complaints from the left that the president is an authoritarian, what he is proposing seems relatively restrained. The devil will be in the details. We'll have to see what he actually issues. If in fact he does issue the more restrained version that he was describing, why wouldn't he propose the more aggressive version which I floated? I suspect he considered something like that and concluded that it would be more vulnerable to a court challenge and would be more likely to be viewed as overly aggressive, especially by students and their parents who may be expecting to use federally subsidized student loans and fearful that the executive order would prevent them from doing so. We'll have to wait and see whether the more restrained version succeeds. It would seem likely to do so at universities which receive a substantial amount of federal research dollars, but for those which don't, such as a number of community colleges, perhaps not. Next topic. Another hate crime hoax. For those of you who are disgusted by the Jussie Smollett matter, where he apparently faked a hate crime, we may have a new instance of one that you can argue is even more disgusting. As you may recall, if the Jussie Smollett hoax occurred as alleged, then he thought he managed to act out being the victim of a crime under a security camera, with the act apparently, in his view, being sufficiently convincing to deceive the public. Think for a moment about the rioting which might have occurred if the public saw film footage of what they believed to be a black, gay public figure being beaten up, having a noose placed around his neck, and bleach poured on him by two white attackers shouting racial and homophobic epithets, and this is MAGA country. When you think about him being willing to risk rioting to get a pay raise, it is truly disgusting. But now we have another alleged hate crime hoax which some will find even more disgusting. Specifically, a gay rights activist in Michigan is accused of intentionally burning down his house 2 years ago, killing his 2 cats and 3 dogs. Nikki Jolly, a 54-year-old resident of Jackson, Michigan, was born a woman, but identifies as a man. He purportedly burned down the house and claimed it was a hate crime to bring more attention to his causes. I don't know anything about the 3 cats who perished in the fire, but the 2 dogs were apparently German Shepherds. The attorney for Mr. Jolly disputes that the fire was a hate crime hoax. The attorney asserts that Mr. Jolly never claimed the fire was a hate crime, and he also asserts that Mr. Jolly did not start the fire. The police concluded, based on the timeline of events, that there was only a 5-minute window for a third person to enter the house, splash gasoline around the rooms, and ignite the fire without being seen. The fact that such a narrow window was available to a third party was one of the reasons they directed their investigation back towards Mr. Jolly. They note that when interviewed by city police and the FBI, Mr. Jolly neither admitted nor denied starting the fire. As noted in the Fox News online coverage of the arrest, In an article by Lucia Suarez-Sang on February 28, the report from a police investigation of the incident, quote, suggests a possible reason for the arson could have been Jolly's apparent frustration with the recent lack of controversy and protests surrounding gay rights in Jackson after the passage of the non-discrimination law, the Detroit News reported, close quote. As I reported in a prior episode, the number of hoax hate crimes in this country is staggering. Unfortunately, we shouldn't really be surprised. Victims of any crime deserve our sympathy. Victims of hate crimes definitely deserve our sympathy. What is happening on the left is something different. Victimhood is celebrated to the point that it's viewed as an achievement, a confirmation of the truth of what is being preached on the left. When you celebrate and elevate and honor and speak endlessly about victims of hate crimes, including compensating them to appear at political events, and they're able to advance their careers based on having been victims, nobody should be surprised by the huge numbers of hoax hate crimes we've seen in the last 2 years. Unfortunately, it has become par for the course. And, as has been noted by many others, every one of these hoax hate crimes detracts from the recognition of actual hate crimes. If, in fact, the burning down of Mr. Jolly's house and the killing of his 5 pets is proven to be a hoax hate crime which he committed, I hope that he's punished severely, including a substantial time in prison. I'll keep you advised regarding the results of this case. Next topic. Three quick points. I'm going to talk about 3 separate issues, but consider them as one topic, not because they really are one topic, because they actually aren't. You've just heard enough pouring alcohol sounds, and there's no need to split these up 3 different times by the sounds of pouring drinks. The first subject is President Trump's talk with North Korean President Kim Jong Un in Vietnam. Now, this wouldn't normally be a brief topic, because it's obviously a critical one and certainly worthy of a lengthy discussion. But I'm going to assume that you've already seen substantial coverage on this issue. I just want to make 2 simple points. The first one is we really don't know the end of this story. Negotiation is a process. Any of us who have engaged in high-level negotiations knows that they can take quite some time, and that each discussion, each action taken is an element of the negotiation. Walking away from a meeting, as President Trump recently did, is an element of the negotiation. I view it as a positive that he took that step rather than a negative. It would have been better, of course, if a positive resolution of the nuclear question had been reached in Vietnam. But when a positive resolution was not on the table, because Kim Jong Un insisted on the lifting of all sanctions in exchange simply for a promise to denuclearize, Trump walked away. And that was the smart thing to do. The media on the left, including CNN and MSNBC, of course, were critical of the president, with some of the left referring to his actions as a failure. To them, I would point out that there can be no doubt, based on their prior conduct, that if the president had accepted what Kim Jong Un proposed, they would have characterized his actions as a capitulation to the dictator. In other words, there was no way Trump could win with them. All the more reason to follow my guidance to get your news and opinion from multiple sources with different points of view, and take it all with a grain of salt. The next subject comes from an article in Politico. On February 27, 2019, Politico published an article by Stephen Shepard entitled, Pew, Phone Polling in Crisis Again. The author begins by noting, quote, the percentage of Americans willing to participate in telephone polls has hit a new low, according to a new report, raising doubts about the continued viability of the phone surveys that have traditionally dominated parties and elections, both in the media and in campaigns, close quote. The new low is 6%. That compares to a rate of 36% in 1997. Why the huge drop-off? Well, the article points to a few potential reasons, such as caller ID and the proliferation of telemarketing. I suspect that the angry divide within America on political issues is another contributing factor. But on this specific question of phone calls and response rates, I suspect caller ID and persons being sick of telemarketing really are the two main reasons for the drop. Most people I know won't even answer the phone if caller ID is blocked, or if it shows something that would indicate a marketing call of some sort. I personally am absolutely sick of marketing calls, and I simply won't answer a poll over the phone. But with only a 6% response rate, you have to ask whether a phone poll can be accurate. When less than 1 in 16 people are even willing to answer poll questions over the phone, doesn't it seem that those individuals must be... When less than 1 in 16 people are even willing to answer poll questions over the phone, doesn't it seem that those individuals must to some significant extent differ from the other 15? How are they representative of the voting population? The Politico article asserts that some polling organizations have been able to adjust by making complex adjustments to ensure that they have a representative sample. I'm not saying they can't succeed in doing that. Let's just say I'm skeptical. So if you can't conduct a phone poll, what can you do? Well, per the Politico article, you turn to online polling. Online polling can be accurate at the national level, especially if you do a good job of selecting a representative panel and you continue to go back to that same panel to track changes over time. But as the article points out, setting up panels that way doesn't really work for smaller polling at the state level, and definitely not at the congressional district level. Not only does that present a problem for polling for congressional races and state and local government races, but it presents a serious problem as well for the presidential race. Remember, we have an electoral college. What matters in the presidential race is what states you win to get their electors. As Hillary Clinton can definitely attest, it doesn't matter whether you win the national popular vote. The absence of state polling would be a serious problem for those interested in predicting the outcomes of the 2020 presidential election. Look at how unevenly distributed Hillary Clinton's popular vote advantage was in 2016. Her entire 2.8 million vote margin is represented in metropolitan New York City and metropolitan Los Angeles. Or alternatively, it's substantially exceeded just in California alone. Just a slight overrepresentation from either of those jurisdictions in a national poll could produce a substantially inaccurate poll result. Moreover, even if those jurisdictions weren't overrepresented, if the Democrat candidate in 2020 wins the bluest of the blue states by large margins and loses purple states by small margins, then, as in 2016, the national polling would not predict a winner of the 2020 election. We need state polling to have a decent idea of who's going to win. So why do we need polling? It doesn't determine the winner. There's no legal obligation to conduct it. Well, what happens these days when you get a surprise winner? The losing side believes something inappropriate or illegal was done to produce the unexpected results. They might even believe that the election was illegitimate, that it was hacked. Do I have a solution? No, I don't. I certainly can't argue that everyone needs to answer polls on their phones, given that I never do so, and nobody's going to listen to me anyways. They're just as sick as I am of hearing from Heather from Account Services or someone concerned about my auto warranty expiring. People just aren't going to answer polls over the phone. The tiny portion that will is likely to get smaller and smaller until it virtually disappears. Combine that polling problem with the fact that so many Trump supporters feel pressured to suppress their support for the president, thus reducing the extent to which people are aware of the number of Trump supporters out there, and you have a recipe for a preference cascade, as I talked about in the earliest episodes of this podcast. We could be looking forward to a 2020 election where the result is radically different from what the pundits expect. If so, here we go again. So what's our last topic? I've been on Twitter for a few months, and I have to admit I really enjoy it. I know some criticize it as bringing out the worst in people, and I know what they mean. But I also think it's a great way to exercise your mental capacity to make an argument. although admittedly you have to find a way to make that argument with very few words. I've been in a couple of Twitter battles, and I have to acknowledge I had a good time, although I suspect the person on the other side didn't. It's also kind of fun when you make a witty quip, even a stupid little one, and you get some positive feedback from the people who like it. But none of that is really earth-shattering. It isn't really weighty. It doesn't compare to the impact of some of the better videos on YouTube, such as the nearly endless string of very informative Jordan Peterson videos, the likewise nearly endless string of extremely informative Prager University videos, and the numerous clips of Ben Shapiro swatting down arguments from leftists on campuses. But I stumbled on something yesterday that really struck me, because an extremely informed, extremely capable, and extremely intelligent Twitter user was able to rip apart with just a few words some of the most ridiculous lunacy coming from the left. And unfortunately, that ridiculous lunacy has a fair number of supporters out there, so it was desperately needed that someone rip it apart. The lunacy was the Green New Deal and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's support of it. Now, I've done a pretty good job of attacking it, but more recently, on Twitter, it was attacked by Patrick Moore, the co-founder of Greenpeace. He bills himself as the sensible environmentalist. He has an extensive background in biology and ecology, and he co-founded Greenpeace, but dropped out of it because it had been, quote, hijacked by eco-fascists, close quote. So how effectively does Moore deal with AOC's positions? I'll give you a brief statement from AOC on Twitter and Patrick Moore's response. First, from AOC, quote, "Yup, if you don't like the hashtag Green New Deal, then come up with your ambitious, on-scale proposal to address the global climate crisis. Until then, we're in charge, and you're just shouting from the cheap seats," close quote. Moore's response, quote, "Pompous little twit, you don't have a plan to grow food for 8 billion people without fossil fuels, or get the food into the cities. Horses? If fossil fuels were banned, every tree in the world would be cut down for fuel for cooking and heating. You would bring about mass death," close quote. That's a devastatingly effective response by Moore. I suspect it raised a point that many on the left had not considered, specifically that fossil fuels are a critical component of the food production and delivery system. So much time has been spent arguing about methane produced by animals like cows and whether we're going to end up eating hamburgers or black bean burgers that there hasn't been that much discussion of how the feed gets transported to the cows, or the cows get transported to the slaughterhouse, or how the beans get planted, harvested, and transported to the granary, let alone how any of the resultant food products get transported to the cities. Patrick Moore is an extremely knowledgeable environmental scientist with an impeccable pedigree in protecting the environment. I'm now following him on Twitter so that his comments appear in my Twitter feed. If you follow me on Twitter at Franklin Rye, and I encourage you to do so, please be sure to read Patrick Moore's tweets. I'm sure you'll find them entertaining and enlightening, as I do. Next week, I'll be back with another episode of Political Spirits. I hope you find it entertaining and enlightening. Until then, be sure to tell your friends about Political Spirits, and follow me on Twitter at Franklin Rye. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.